Chapter 1. The Promise. There is a place in northern Ukraine that is more dangerous than any nuclear bomb ever dropped. A place that contains more radioactive material than any weapon, more broken promises than any government, and more lies than any disaster in modern history. That place is called Chernobyl. It sits just 110 kilometers from Kyiv, wrapped in concrete and steel, surrounded by 2,600 square kilometers of abandoned land where no one lives and no one should live. But when construction began in 1970, no one believed this was possible. The Soviet Union was at its peak. There was no fear of failure. There were no contingency plans. There were no doubts. There was only ambition, ideology, and the absolute certainty that Soviet engineering could master the atom better than any other nation on the planet. Chernobyl was not going to be just a nuclear plant. It was going to be the ultimate proof. Proof that communism could build faster, think smarter, and produce more energy than capitalism. It would power millions of homes, silence the critics, and become the ultimate symbol of Soviet technological might. And for 16 years, it worked. The turbines spun, the lights stayed on, engineers received medals, and in the reactor core, uranium atoms split with perfectly controlled fury, or so they believed, until 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, when Reactor 4 exploded. An explosion so brutal it contaminated half of Europe and triggered a chain reaction that did not just destroy a city, but accelerated the fall of an entire empire. This is the story of Chernobyl. How it was built on secrets, how it operated on lies, and how it ended up destroying everything its creators believed in. The decision to build. In 1966, the Soviet Union made a decision that would define its nuclear program for the next 2 decades. They would construct a new type of reactor, one that differed fundamentally from the designs being built in the United States and Western Europe. The RBMK, Reactor Bolshoi Moshnosti Kanalny, or High-Power Channel Reactor, was a uniquely Soviet creation. Western nations had settled on pressurized water reactors contained within massive steel vessels. The Soviets chose a different path. The RBMK would be enormous, a vertical cylinder 7 meters in diameter and 7 meters tall, penetrated by 1,661 pressure tubes, each containing uranium fuel. The design allowed for continuous refueling while the reactor operated, a feature Western designs lacked. This meant Soviet plants could generate electricity without shutting down for fuel replacement. The decision was driven by multiple factors. The RBMK could be built faster than Western designs because it did not require a single massive pressure vessel, which Soviet metallurgy struggled to produce at the required scale and quality. The modular design meant construction could proceed in stages. Components could be manufactured at different facilities and assembled on-site.
Another reason, never officially acknowledged, the RBMK produced plutonium as a byproduct of operation, weapons-grade plutonium. The reactor served dual purposes, generating electricity for civilian use while producing material for the Soviet nuclear arsenal. This was not unusual. Many reactors worldwide served similar functions. But it meant the RBMK's design prioritized plutonium production alongside power generation, a compromise that would have consequences. The Soviet scientific community was divided. Some physicists warned that the RBMK had an inherent instability at low power levels. The reactor's positive void coefficient meant that under certain conditions, reducing water in the core would increase reactivity rather than decrease it. This violated a fundamental principle of reactor safety. Systems should become less reactive when coolant is lost, not more. Western reactors had negative void coefficients. Losing coolant made them safer, not more dangerous. But the RBMK's graphite moderator and water coolant configuration created the opposite effect. At low power, removing water meant removing a neutron absorber, which increased fission rates, which generated more heat, which created more steam, which removed more water. A potential runaway reaction. The designers knew this. They implemented systems to prevent the reactor from operating at dangerously low power levels. They installed emergency shutdown mechanisms. They created protocols that, if followed, would keep the reactor in safe operating ranges. They believed Soviet discipline and training would prevent operators from ever entering the dangerous zones. The State Committee on the Utilization of Atomic Energy approved the design in 1966. Construction of the first RBMK-1000 would begin at Leningrad in 1970. But the most ambitious project would be built in Ukraine, in a location chosen for its proximity to water, electrical transmission infrastructure, and political considerations that had nothing to do with safety. The site. The town that would become Pripyat did not exist in 1970. The land was marshland and pine forest along the Pripyat River, sparsely populated by farmers and fishermen who had occupied the region for centuries. The river flowed through Belarus and Ukraine before joining the Dnieper, providing the massive water supply a nuclear plant required. The location was strategic, far enough from Kyiv to avoid alarming the capital's population, close enough to connect to the electrical grid that powered Soviet Ukraine. The Pripyat River offered unlimited cooling water. The remote location meant fewer people to evacuate if something went wrong, a consideration that appeared in planning documents but was never openly discussed. In February 1970, the Soviet government issued the decree authorizing construction. The Chernobyl nuclear power station would eventually house 6 RBMK-1000 reactors, each capable of generating 1,000 megawatts of electrical power. When completed, it would be one of the largest nuclear facilities on Earth. The first workers arrived in spring. They came from across the Soviet Union: Russian engineers, Ukrainian laborers, Belarusian technicians. Most were young, drawn by higher wages and the promise of modern housing. The government offered incentives. Workers who helped build the plant would receive apartments in the new city being constructed nearby. These were not the cramped communal apartments common in Soviet cities, but modern units with private bathrooms and central heating. The new city would be called Pripyat, named for the river. It would be a model Soviet town, designed to demonstrate that workers in even the most technically demanding industries could enjoy comfortable, cultured lives. Pripyat would have schools, hospitals, shops, a cultural center, an amusement park, everything needed for a population projected to reach 75,000. Construction began on Reactor 1 in 1972. The work was brutal. Heavy equipment struggled in marshy soil. Supplies arrived irregularly because the rail line to the site was incomplete. Workers lived in temporary barracks with minimal heating. Winter temperatures dropped to -20 Celsius. Summer brought heat and mosquitoes from the surrounding wetlands. The pace was relentless. Soviet nuclear ambitions demanded rapid construction. 5-year plans set quotas that had to be met regardless of conditions. Supervisors faced consequences for delays. Workers faced pressure to cut corners to maintain schedules. Quality control was inconsistent. Welds went uninspected. Concrete cured improperly in freezing weather. Components arrived damaged and were installed anyway because replacing them would cause delays. Some engineers raised concerns.
They were told the plant's safety systems would compensate for minor construction flaws. The reactor's defenses operated in layers, multiple redundant systems designed to prevent any single failure from causing catastrophe. Even if construction was imperfect, the design would protect against human error. By 1977, Reactor 1 was complete. On September 26, it achieved criticality, the point where the nuclear chain reaction becomes self-sustaining. Steam began flowing to turbines. Electricity began flowing to the grid. The first megawatts generated at Chernobyl lit homes across Ukraine. The achievement was celebrated. Workers received bonuses. Engineers received medals. The Communist Party declared the plant's completion a triumph of Soviet science. Pravda published articles praising the facility as evidence of socialism's technological superiority. Reactor 2 came online in 1978, Reactor 3 in 1981. Reactor 4 began commercial operation on March 27, 1984. Each reactor fed 1,000 megawatts into the Soviet power grid. Together, they generated enough electricity to power a city of several million people. By 1986, Chernobyl was one of the most productive nuclear facilities in the Soviet Union. It employed approximately 5,000 people. The town of Pripyat had grown to 49,000 residents. The city had everything promised: apartments, schools, hospitals, shops, even a new amusement park scheduled to open on May 1st for May Day celebrations. The reactors operated continuously, except for scheduled maintenance. Steam turbines spun at 3,000 revolutions per minute. Control rods moved up and down in their channels, adjusting reactivity. Operators monitored instruments that displayed neutron flux, coolant temperature, steam pressure. Everything appeared normal. The systems worked. The safeguards held. Nothing suggested that deep within Reactor 4's core, conditions were developing that would lead to the worst nuclear accident in history. The operators. The men who controlled Chernobyl's reactors were not careless. They were trained technicians, many with university degrees in nuclear physics or engineering. They had passed rigorous examinations. They understood reactor theory. They had operated the plant for years without serious incident. Anatoly Dyatlov was deputy chief engineer responsible for Reactor 4's operation. He was 56 years old in 1986, a veteran of the Soviet nuclear program. He had worked at nuclear facilities since the 1950s, including time at a plutonium production reactor, where he received significant radiation exposure during an accident in 1962. The exposure had made him irritable and impatient, though he remained competent. Dyatlov was ambitious. He wanted to demonstrate his competence to supervisors in Moscow. He wanted to prove that he could execute complex procedures flawlessly. And on the night of April 25, 1986, he would be in charge of a test that required precise coordination. The test itself was not inherently dangerous. Engineers wanted to determine whether Reactor 4's turbines could generate enough electricity during coast-down, the period after steam was cut off but before they stopped spinning, to power emergency cooling pumps until backup diesel generators started. This was important. If external power failed and the diesels took time to start, the turbine's residual rotation might provide critical seconds of cooling. The procedure required reducing Reactor 4's power between 700 and 1,000 megawatts, cutting steam to turbine 8, and measuring whether it could power the pumps as it slowed. The procedure had been attempted before at other reactors with mixed results. This time, Dyatlov wanted perfect data. The test was scheduled for the afternoon of April 25th. Reactor 4 began its power reduction at 1 a.m. that day. Operators withdrew control rods, allowing power to drop gradually. Everything proceeded normally until 2 p.m. when Kyiv's grid controller requested that Chernobyl delay the test. Electricity demand was high. They needed Reactor 4 to continue generating power. Dyatlov agreed to the delay. The reactor would be held at reduced power, around 1,600 megawatts, until evening when demand dropped. This created a problem. Holding the reactor at mid-power for hours allowed Xenon-135 to accumulate in the core. Xenon-135 is a fission product that absorbs neutrons. At high power levels, it burns away as fast as it forms. But at mid-power, it accumulates. The longer the reactor operates at reduced power, the more xenon builds up. This is called xenon poisoning, and it makes the reactor harder to control because xenon absorbs the neutrons needed to sustain fission. By 11 p.m. on April 25th, when Kyiv finally released Chernobyl to proceed with the test, xenon poisoning had saturated Reactor 4's core. When operators resumed the power reduction, reactivity plummeted faster than expected. They tried to level off at 700 megawatts. Instead, power dropped to 30 megawatts. This was dangerous. At very low power, the RBMK's positive void coefficient became pronounced. The reactor was now in an unstable operating regime where even small changes could cause large power swings. Procedures required shutting down if power fell below 700 megawatts, but shutting down would mean postponing the test for days until xenon decayed. Dyatlov refused to abort. He ordered operators to raise power by withdrawing more control rods from the core. They pulled rods until they reached the minimum allowed for safe operation. Only a few rods remained inserted. The reactor was now in a configuration outside approved parameters. Power stabilized around 200 megawatts, far below the planned test level, but enough for Dyatlov to proceed. He was under pressure. The test had been delayed multiple times. His superiors expected results. Aborting now would look like failure. At 1 p.m. on April 26th, the test began. Operators shut off the automatic reactor trip systems that would normally shut down the reactor if anything went wrong. This was allowed under test procedures to prevent automatic shutdowns from interfering with measurements. But it meant all safety now depended on human judgment. At 1:22 a.m., operators closed valves to cut steam flow to turbine 8. The turbine began coasting down. Its generator continued producing electricity as it slowed, powering the emergency pumps as designed. But cutting steam to the turbine meant steam remained in the reactor. Water pumps continued flowing at full rate, but less water was evaporating into steam. The core began flooding with water. In a normal reactor, this would be fine. More water means more cooling. But in the RBMK at low power with a positive void coefficient, more water meant fewer steam bubbles. Fewer bubbles meant less neutron absorption by steam. Less absorption meant more fission. More fission meant more heat. More heat created more steam, which removed more water, which reduced absorption, which increased fission. The reactor was entering a positive feedback loop. Operators saw power rising. They pressed the AZ5 button, the emergency shutdown that would insert all control rods simultaneously. In a functioning reactor, this would terminate fission within seconds. But Chernobyl's RBMK had a design flaw
that had never been publicly acknowledged. The control rods had graphite tips. When fully withdrawn, these tips sat above the core. When operators pressed AZ5, the rods dropped,
But the graphite tips entered the bottom of the core first, before the neutron-absorbing boron reached the reaction zone. Graphite is a moderator. It increases reactivity. For approximately 3 seconds, inserting the control rods actually increased fission at the bottom of the core rather than stopping it. At low power, with xenon poisoning and maximum water flow, those 3 seconds were enough. Reactivity spiked. Power surged from 200 megawatts to 33,000 megawatts in less than 5 seconds, more than 30 times the reactor's rated capacity. Fuel pellets shattered from thermal shock. Water flashed instantly to steam at thousands of degrees. Pressure inside the core exceeded design limits. At exactly 1:23:40 a.m., Reactor 4's 2,000-ton upper biological shield, nicknamed Elena after the wife of the engineer who designed it, lifted off its supports and tilted. The reactor building's roof panels blew outward. 7 seconds later, a second, larger explosion tore the reactor apart. Some researchers believe this was a nuclear explosion, not a nuclear weapons fission-driven detonation, but a runaway chain reaction that achieved brief criticality before the core disintegrated. Others attribute it to steam. The truth remains debated. What is not debated is the result. The explosion ejected the reactor's 2,000-ton upper lid, which landed vertically in the destroyed core, propped at an angle like a gravestone. It launched radioactive debris, fragments of fuel, graphite moderator, and steel, hundreds of meters into the night sky. 50 tons of vaporized nuclear fuel formed a radioactive cloud that would spread across Europe. The explosion killed 2 men instantly. Valery Hodimchuk, a pump operator in the circulation system, disappeared. His body was never recovered. Vladimir Shashanok, an automatic systems adjuster, died of crushed lungs from steam trauma within hours. Fires ignited across the destroyed reactor hall. Graphite blocks scattered across what remained of the roof burned at 2,000 degrees Celsius. The wind blew sparks toward the still operating Reactor 3, which shared a wall and ventilation system with the destroyed unit. Above the ruined reactor, a pillar of ionized air glowed blue-violet from Cherenkov radiation. This was not smoke. This was radiation so intense it made air itself luminescent. The worst nuclear disaster in history had begun. Chapter 2. The Fire. The first firefighters arrived at 1:28 a.m., 5 minutes after the explosion. They came from Pripyat's fire station number 2, less than 3 kilometers from the plant. The call reported a fire at the power station. Nothing suggested this was different from the industrial fires they had fought before. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik commanded the first crew. He was 23 years old, recently married, ambitious and well-trained. His team consisted of 16 firefighters in 2 trucks. They drove through the spring night, expecting to find burning equipment. Maybe a transformer fire, something manageable. What they found was hell. The reactor hall was gone. In its place, a crater glowed with fires burning at temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Chunks of graphite, some weighing hundreds of kilograms, lay scattered across the ground and rooftops. These blocks glowed cherry red in the darkness. When firefighters approached them, their radiation detectors went off the scale. The detectors maxed out at 3.6 Roentgen per hour. The actual radiation levels near the exposed reactor core exceeded 20,000 Roentgen per hour, enough to deliver a lethal dose in minutes.
The firefighters' instruments could not measure what they were walking into because the numbers were beyond anything the designers had considered possible. Pravik made a decision that would save lives and cost him his own. The primary danger was fire spreading to Reactor 3. If its hull caught fire, a second reactor could be destroyed. His orders were to prevent that at all costs. He sent his teams onto the roof between Reactors 3 and 4. This roof was covered in bitumen, a tar-like substance that caught fire easily. Burning graphite fragments had already ignited multiple spots. Firefighters climbed ladders, carrying hoses, breathing apparatus on their backs, unaware they were absorbing radiation doses that would kill them. The roof gave way beneath their feet. Bitumen melted in the heat. Men stumbled into gaps, catching themselves on beams. The radiation was so intense that those who held graphite fragments, thinking they were ordinary debris, suffered radiation burns that went through their gloves into their hands within seconds. More crews arrived. Fire Station No. 1 from Chernobyl town sent reinforcements. Lieutenant Viktor Kibanok led this second wave. He was 35, an experienced officer who understood fire behavior. When he saw the scale of the disaster, he requested additional support from Kyiv, from Chernigov, from every available station within 100 kilometers. By 2 a.m., 28 fire crews were fighting the blaze. They focused on preventing spread rather than extinguishing the core fire. The reactor itself could not be extinguished with water. It was not burning in the traditional sense. The graphite moderator was oxidizing in air at 2,000 degrees Celsius, a chemical reaction that would continue until the oxygen was exhausted or the graphite was consumed. Water poured into the reactor would flash to steam, potentially causing hydrogen explosions. The firefighters did not know this. They only knew their water had no effect on the main fire. So they concentrated on the peripheral blazes, on the roof, in the turbine hall, anywhere fire threatened to spread to intact structures. The radiation did things to men that none of them had seen before. Skin turned red within an hour, not from heat, but from radiation burns that went through their gloves into their hands within seconds. Pravik stayed on the roof for hours. He directed operations, moved hose lines, climbed into positions his men were too exhausted to reach. Every minute added to his
radiation dose. Every breath drew radioactive particles into his lungs. By 3 a.m., he had absorbed approximately 1,600 rem. A dose above 500 rem is typically fatal. He had received more than 3 times that amount. Kibanok worked beside him. The two commanders coordinated their teams, sharing information about where the roof was weakest, where fires were spreading, where additional hoses were needed. Neither mentioned the radiation. Whether from ignorance or determination, they focused entirely on the tactical problem of containing the fire. At 4 a.m., Kibanok radioed that the fire on Reactor 3's roof was under control. This was the critical victory. If Reactor 3 caught fire while still operating, its core could also be destroyed. The firefighters had prevented the catastrophe from doubling. But the main reactor fire continued to burn. The graphite core, exposed to air, would burn for days. There was nothing the firefighters could do about it. Their job now was containment. Keep it from spreading, keep additional reactors from being damaged, except that Reactor 4 was lost. By 5 a.m., as dawn broke over Ukraine, the immediate fire threat had been contained. Peripheral blazes were extinguished. Reactor 3 was safe. The destroyed Reactor 4 continued to burn, but it was no longer spreading. The firefighters began to withdraw. Many could no longer stand. Radiation sickness was setting in, nausea,
dizziness, weakness. Pravik collapsed while climbing down from the roof. His men carried him to an ambulance. Kibanak made it down under his own power, but vomited repeatedly. By 6 a.m., 37 of the first responders were showing symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. They were loaded into buses and driven to Pripyat's hospital. The medical staff there had never treated radiation exposure. They had bandages for burns, fluids for dehydration, but nothing specific for the cellular destruction radiation caused. Dr. Valentin Belikhan, the senior physician on duty, examined the first patients and immediately recognized this was beyond his capability. He contacted Moscow, requesting specialists in radiation medicine, but Moscow was hundreds of kilometers away. The firefighters needed treatment now. What Belikhan could offer was supportive care, fluids to combat dehydration from vomiting, pain medication for the burns starting to appear on exposed skin, beds in isolation rooms to protect them from infection. Their immune systems would soon collapse from radiation damage to bone marrow. Any infection could kill them. The hospital filled rapidly. Ambulances continued arriving through the morning. Firefighters, plant operators, security personnel, anyone who had been near the reactor in the first hours. The waiting room became a triage center. Those who could walk were sent to regular beds. Those who could not were placed in intensive care. Pravik and Kibanak were in the worst condition. Both had been on the roof for over 3 hours. Both had absorbed doses exceeding 1,000 rem. Dr. Belikhan knew these men were dying. He could not say this to them or their families, but he knew. There was no treatment that could save someone who had absorbed that much radiation. He made them comfortable, he gave them fluids, he monitored their vital signs, and he waited for the specialists from Moscow, knowing they would arrive too late to change anything. Meanwhile, at the destroyed reactor, engineers were trying to understand what had happened. The explosion had destroyed the control room's instruments. No one knew the reactor's condition. Was the core still reacting? Was there risk of another explosion? How much radioactive material had been released? Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, who had supervised the test that caused the disaster, initially refused to
believe the reactor was destroyed. He had been in the control room when the explosion occurred. The force had thrown him against a wall. He suffered a concussion and radiation exposure, but he could still function. When subordinates told him the reactor core was exposed, he called them liars. He insisted it was impossible. Soviet reactors did not explode. There must be some other explanation. Perhaps the hydrogen tanks had detonated. Perhaps there had been a steam explosion in the cooling system. But the core itself could not be destroyed. He sent men to look at the reactor and report back. They climbed through wreckage to positions where they could see into the crater. What they saw was unmistakable. The reactor hull was gone. The core was exposed. Chunks of fuel lay scattered in the ruins. They reported this to Dyatlov. He still refused to accept it. He accused them of panic, of misinterpreting what they had seen. But the evidence kept accumulating. Radiation readings that exceeded measurement capacity, fires that water could not extinguish, graphite fragments glowing in the dark. Finally, at approximately 7 a.m., more than 5 hours after the explosion, Dyatlov acknowledged the truth. The reactor had been destroyed. The core was exposed, and the radiation being released would contaminate everything for kilometers around. This information needed to reach Moscow immediately. The Communist Party needed to know. The government needed to make decisions about evacuation, about international notifications, about how to manage a disaster of this magnitude. But there was a problem. Admitting the reactor had exploded meant admitting Soviet engineering had failed.
It meant acknowledging that the RBMK design had fundamental flaws. It meant accepting responsibility for the worst industrial accident in Soviet history. So, he lied. And because he lied, decisions that should have been made immediately were delayed. The evacuation that should have begun at dawn did not start. The international notifications that should have gone out within hours were not sent. The emergency response that could have mitigated some of the damage was hamstrung by false information. In Pripyat, families woke to a normal Saturday morning. Parents prepared breakfast. Children got ready for school. No one told them about the radiation cloud drifting over their homes. No one warned them that every breath was pulling radioactive particles into their lungs. No one suggested they should leave. The only visible sign something was wrong was the column of smoke rising from the power plant. But the plant was always releasing steam. Most residents assumed this was normal. A few noticed the smoke looked darker than usual, but they had no context for understanding what that meant. On the destroyed reactor, the graphite fire continued to burn. Each hour, it released more radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. Iodine-131, which concentrates in thyroid glands. Cesium-137, which persists in the environment for decades. Strontium-90, which mimics calcium and deposits in bones. These isotopes were invisible. They had no smell. They could not be detected without instruments, but they were everywhere, settling on rooftops, dissolving in water, being inhaled by every person and animal in the contamination zone. By noon on April 26th, the radiation cloud had spread across northern Ukraine and southern Belarus. Weather patterns carried it northwest toward Scandinavia. Soviet authorities had still not issued any public warnings. They had not contacted neighboring countries. They maintained the fiction that the situation was under control. This lie would persist for another 36 hours until Swedish radiation monitors detected the contamination and demanded an explanation. Only then would the Soviet Union admit that something had gone wrong at Chernobyl, and by then, the damage was done. The firefighters who had saved Reactor 3 were dying in hospital beds. The population of Pripyat had been exposed to radiation for a full day and night. The contamination had spread across international borders, and the graphite fire at the core continued to burn, releasing radiation that would not peak for another 4 days. The disaster that began at 1:23 a.m. on April 26th was still accelerating.
Chapter 3: The Lie. For 36 hours, the Soviet Union told the world that nothing had happened. No explosion, no radiation release, no danger to anyone beyond the plant's immediate vicinity. Just a minor technical incident at a power station in Ukraine, fully under control. Nothing to concern neighboring countries or international authorities. This was not a mistake. This was not confusion in the chaos of disaster response. This was deliberate policy, implemented at the highest levels of Soviet government, designed to protect the reputation of Soviet nuclear technology and avoid admitting that the impossible had occurred. The lie began at 8 a.m. on April 26th, when plant director Viktor Bryukhanov made his first call to Moscow. It continued through the day as officials in Kyiv and Moscow received reports and chose to disbelieve them. It persisted through the night as radiation spread across borders while governments stayed silent. And it would not end until a Swedish scientist 1,200 kilometers away detected contamination that could not be explained and refused to accept the explanations he was given. The truth would emerge not because the Soviet Union chose to reveal it, but because radiation does not respect borders or propaganda. The first day. At 9 a.m. on April 26th, approximately 7.5 hours after the explosion, a meeting convened in the Communist Party headquarters in Kyiv. Officials from the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic gathered to discuss the reports coming from Chernobyl. The information was contradictory. Some sources claimed minor damage, others described catastrophic destruction. The radiation readings made no sense. Either the instruments were malfunctioning or the situation was far worse than anyone was admitting. Vladimir Sherbitsky, first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, chaired the meeting. He was 68 years old, a party loyalist who had held power in Ukraine since 1972. His position depended on maintaining order and meeting production quotas. A nuclear disaster would reflect poorly on his leadership. He needed the situation resolved quickly and quietly. He authorized limited emergency measures. Fire brigades would continue working at the plant. Medical teams would treat the injured. Engineers would assess the damage. But there would be no general evacuation, no public warnings, no notifications to neighboring countries. The situation would be managed internally. This decision condemned thousands of people to unnecessary radiation exposure. In Pripyat, life continued normally. The city of 49,000 awoke to a Saturday morning. Children went to schools that had not been closed. Workers reported to jobs that had not been suspended. Families shopped at markets that had not been warned to discard fresh produce exposed to radioactive fallout. Some residents noticed unusual activity. Military vehicles moving through the streets, helicopters circling the power plant, a strange metallic taste in the air that no one could explain. But without official information, people invented their own explanations. A fire at the plant, a military exercise, nothing serious. The radiation was invisible. It had no smell, it produced no immediate symptoms in most people. So life appeared normal even as contamination accumulated on every surface, in every breath, in the water people drank and the food they ate. At Pripyat Hospital number 126, the situation
was deteriorating. By midday, the facility held 108 patients showing symptoms of acute radiation syndrome. The staff had no specialized training in radiation medicine. They treated burns with ointments designed for thermal injuries. They gave fluids for dehydration. They isolated the most severe cases to prevent infection. But they could do nothing to address the cellular damage radiation was causing. The firefighters who had fought the blaze were in the worst condition. Their white blood cell counts were dropping as radiation destroyed their bone marrow. Their skin was blistering in patterns that matched their clothing, radiation burns developing where fabric had pressed radioactive particles against skin. Some were already showing signs of gastrointestinal damage, bleeding internally as radiation killed the cells lining their digestive systems. Dr. Valentin Belikhan knew these men needed treatment beyond anything his hospital could provide. Moscow had promised to send specialists, but they had not arrived. He continued supportive care and hoped they would come soon. At 2 p.m., a government commission arrived from Moscow. It was led by Boris Sherbina, deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, a coal industry administrator with no nuclear expertise. He had been selected not for his technical knowledge, but for his political reliability. His job was to assess the situation and determine what measures were necessary. Sherbina's first briefing came from Bryukhanov, who continued to minimize the severity of the disaster. Yes, there had been an explosion. Yes, there was a fire,
but the reactor core was intact. Radiation levels were elevated but not dangerous. The situation was manageable. Sherbina toured the plant from a safe distance. He did not approach the destroyed reactor. He did not inspect the exposed core. He relied on reports from subordinates who themselves were repeating information they wanted to be true rather than information they had verified. At 4 p.m., Sherbina convened a meeting in Pripyat to decide on next steps. He asked technical experts to assess radiation levels and predict contamination spread. The answers he received depended on who was speaking. Plant officials claimed low levels. Independent scientists brought from Moscow reported readings that would require immediate evacuation. Sherbina faced the same choice Sherbitsky had faced that morning: believe optimistic assessments that required minimal action, or believe alarming data that demanded drastic measures. He chose optimism. The decision to evacuate Pripyat would not be made that day. Instead, he ordered limited protective measures. Residents should stay indoors. Windows should be closed. Children should not play outside. But no evacuation. No public announcement explaining the danger. Just recommendations that sounded like suggestions rather than emergency protocols. This halfway approach satisfied no one. It was not enough to protect the population from radiation exposure, but it was enough to alarm people who recognized that if the government was telling them to stay inside, something serious must be happening. Rumors began to spread through the city. People who worked at the plant told their families what they had heard. Medical staff at the hospital mentioned to friends that firefighters were showing radiation burns. Residents who had radiation detectors, some kept as souvenirs from military service, took readings and found contamination far above normal background levels. By evening, anxiety was spreading through the city. People called relatives in other regions asking for information. They listened to foreign radio broadcasts looking for news, but Soviet media said nothing. Television showed normal programming. Newspapers that went to press that afternoon made no mention of Chernobyl. The silence was deliberate. Soviet information policy forbade reporting on disasters without explicit government authorization. No reporter could
publish details about Chernobyl without approval from authorities who had decided that silence served their interests better than transparency. At 8 p.m., as darkness fell over Pripyat, families gathered for dinner without knowing they had been exposed to radiation all day. Children who had played outside that morning had inhaled radioactive particles. Adults who had hung laundry to dry had brought contaminated clothing into their homes. No one had been warned. No one had been given the information needed to protect themselves. Meanwhile, the radiation cloud was spreading. Meteorological conditions that day carried contamination northwest across Belarus and into Poland. By evening, radioactive particles were falling on villages hundreds of kilometers from Chernobyl. People who had never heard of the plant were being exposed to isotopes that would affect their health for decades. And still, no one told them. The second day. Sunday, April 27th, began with clear skies and warm temperatures. In Pripyat, residents who had stayed indoors Saturday ventured outside. The government had not updated its recommendations. No new warnings had been issued. People assumed if the danger had been serious, they would have been told. They were wrong. Radiation levels had not decreased overnight. The graphite fire at Reactor 4's core continued burning, continuing to release radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. Every hour of exposure added to the cumulative doses Pripyat's residents were absorbing. At 10 a.m., a second government meeting convened. This time, the tone was different. Scientists from Moscow had spent the night taking measurements around the plant. Their data could not be dismissed. Radiation levels in Pripyat exceeded safe limits by factors of hundreds. The contamination was not dissipating, it was accumulating. Valery Legasov, first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, presented the case for immediate evacuation. He was one of the Soviet Union's leading nuclear scientists, a man whose expertise could not be questioned. His measurements showed that remaining in Pripyat posed serious health risks, particularly to children whose thyroid glands would concentrate radioactive iodine. Legasov recommended evacuating the entire city within hours. Not tomorrow, not next week, today, now. Every hour of delay meant more radiation exposure for 49,000 people who should have been moved yesterday. Sherbina listened to Legasov's presentation. He understood the scientific argument, but he also understood the political implications. Evacuating Pripyat would require buses, thousands of them. It would require shelter for displaced families. It would require explanations about why people were being forced from their homes. And it would require admitting that the situation was far more serious than the government had acknowledged. The discussion lasted 2 hours. Officials debated logistics, timing, messaging. Some argued for a gradual evacuation over several days. Others wanted to wait until radiation levels decreased naturally. Legasov insisted that every hour mattered. Radiation was accumulating in bodies. Thyroid doses in children were already concerning. Waiting would make things worse, not better. At 10 a.m., a second government meeting convened. This time, the tone was different. Scientists from Moscow had spent the night taking measurements around the plant. Their data could not be dismissed. Radiation levels in Pripyat exceeded safe limits by factors of hundreds. The contamination was not dissipating, it was accumulating.
Forever. At 1 p.m., loudspeakers throughout Pripyat crackled to life. A message played on repeat. Attention, residents of Pripyat. Due to the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, unfavorable radiation conditions are developing in the city. The Communist Party and government authorities have decided to temporarily evacuate the city's residents. Buses will arrive at 2 p.m. Bring your documents, essential items, and food for 3 days. Apartments will be sealed to protect your property. The evacuation is temporary. You will return soon. People heard the announcement and felt relief. They were finally being moved away from whatever danger existed at the plant, and it was only temporary, 3 days. They could manage 3 days away from home. Families packed small bags, parents gathered children, people locked their apartments and waited for the buses. Some took photographs of their homes, some left notes for neighbors. Most expected to return the following week. At 2 p.m., 1,100 buses began arriving in Pripyat. They had been requisitioned from across Ukraine and driven through the night. Drivers had been told there was an emergency but not given details about radiation. Many would receive significant doses themselves during the evacuation. The boarding was orderly. Residents lined up by apartment block. Buses filled with families carrying luggage and children. The process took 3 hours. By 5 p.m., the last bus was pulling away from Pripyat. The city that had held 49,000 people that morning was empty by evening. Apartments stood unlocked. Dishes sat unwashed in sinks. Laundry hung on balconies. Toys lay abandoned in playgrounds. The Ferris wheel in the amusement park, which had never opened to the public, stood motionless against the sky. Pripyat had become a ghost city in a single afternoon. The evacuated residents were taken to villages and towns outside the contamination zone. They were processed through registration centers where their names were recorded and temporary housing assigned. Medical teams screened for radiation exposure, taking measurements and blood samples to establish baseline data.
Many residents showed elevated levels of radioactive iodine in their thyroid glands. The exposure had occurred over the previous 36 hours while they went about their normal lives without warnings or protection. Children showed the highest levels. Their smaller thyroid glands concentrated iodine-131 more efficiently than adults. The medical consequences of this exposure would not be fully understood for years, but in that moment, doctors knew enough to be concerned. Thyroid cancer rates in this population would almost certainly increase. The magnitude of that increase would depend on doses received, ages of those exposed, and other factors that would take decades to untangle. But the evacuees from Pripyat were at least receiving medical attention. Hundreds of thousands of other people in the broader contamination zone remained in their homes, unaware they were being exposed, receiving no medical screening, accumulating radiation doses that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The world finds out. At 7 a.m. on Monday, April 28, 1,200 kilometers northwest of Chernobyl, a scientist at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden noticed something unusual. Cliff Robinson, a radiation safety officer, was conducting routine monitoring when his detectors showed elevated levels of radioactive isotopes on workers' shoes as they entered the plant. This made no sense. The contamination was on the outside of their shoes. They had brought it into the plant from outside. But Forsmark's reactors were operating normally. There was no internal contamination. The radioactivity had to be coming from somewhere else. He expanded his testing. He checked the ground outside the plant. He checked air filters. He checked rainwater. Everything showed contamination. Radioactive cesium, iodine, and other fission products.
Isotope ratios indicated recent nuclear fission, not residual contamination from old weapons tests. There had been a nuclear accident somewhere, and the fallout had reached Sweden. Robinson reported his findings to Swedish authorities. They immediately began checking other facilities. Every nuclear plant in Sweden showed the same contamination pattern: radioactive particles in the air, elevated readings on surfaces, all consistent with exposure to a radiation plume from a recent reactor accident. But Sweden's reactors were all operating normally. So were Finland's. So were those in Western Europe. The contamination had to be coming from somewhere else. Meteorological analysis showed the air mass over Sweden had originated in the Soviet Union. At 9 a.m., Swedish diplomats contacted the Soviet embassy in Stockholm demanding information. Had there been an accident at a Soviet nuclear facility? The embassy claimed to have no information. The diplomats persisted. The contamination over Sweden was undeniable. It had to have a source. If the Soviet Union had experienced a nuclear accident, international agreements required them to notify affected countries. The Soviet embassy continued to deny knowledge. They claimed to be checking with Moscow. They suggested the contamination might be from Swedish facilities. They deflected and delayed while Sweden's measurements continued showing radioactivity that could only have come from a major nuclear accident. At 3 p.m., Sweden went public. The Swedish National Institute of Radiation Protection issued a statement. A normal radioactivity has been detected across Sweden. The isotope composition indicates a recent nuclear accident. Based on atmospheric modeling, the source appears to be in the Soviet Union. We are requesting information from Soviet authorities. This announcement made international news within hours. Media outlets across Europe reported that Sweden had detected radiation from a suspected Soviet nuclear accident. Other countries began their own measurements and confirmed Sweden's findings. Denmark detected contamination. Finland detected contamination. Poland reported elevated readings. The evidence was overwhelming. There had been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union,
and the Soviet government had said nothing. At 9 p.m. Moscow time on April 28, more than 67 hours after the disaster, Soviet television finally acknowledged the disaster. The newsreader, Sergei Kirilenko, delivered a statement that lasted less than 1 minute. An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the atomic reactors has been damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the accident. Those affected are being given assistance. A government commission has been established. That was all. No details about the explosion, no information about radiation levels, no mention of the evacuation of Pripyat. Just a bare acknowledgement that something had happened, delivered in language designed to minimize rather than inform. This statement raised more questions than it answered. What kind of accident? How many people were affected? How much radiation was released? Where was the contamination spreading? The Soviet government provided no answers. International pressure mounted. Countries across Europe demanded detailed information. Radiation does not stop at borders. If Soviet contamination was affecting their populations, they had a right to know the extent of the danger. The International Atomic Energy Agency requested that the Soviet Union provide technical details about the accident, as required under international agreements. The Soviet response was slow and incomplete. They acknowledged the reactor had been damaged. They admitted some radioactive release had occurred, but they refused to provide specifics about the explosion, the condition of the core, or the amount of material released. This information vacuum created panic. Without official data, people made
Assumptions. Some assumed the worst, that a nuclear explosion had occurred and the Soviet Union was covering up mass casualties. Others assumed exaggeration, that the accident was minor and Western media was inflating the danger. The truth was somewhere in between, but without transparency, no one outside the Soviet government could assess the real situation. The cost of silence. The 36-hour delay in acknowledging the disaster had consequences that extended far beyond public relations. Every hour that people remained in contaminated areas without protection added to their radiation exposure. Every day that passed without warnings meant more people consuming contaminated food and water. In the days immediately after the accident, radioactive iodine-131 was spreading through the environment. This isotope has an 8-day half-life, meaning half of it decays every 8 days. If people had been warned immediately, they could have taken potassium iodide tablets, which saturate the thyroid gland and prevent it from absorbing radioactive iodine. This simple measure, if implemented within hours of the accident, would have dramatically reduced thyroid cancer rates in affected populations. But the warnings came too late. By the time most people learned about the radiation danger, they had already absorbed significant amounts of iodine-131. Their thyroid glands, particularly in children, were already contaminated. The damage was done. Estimates suggest that if evacuation and protective measures had been implemented immediately on April 26th, instead of being delayed until April 27th and 28th, radiation doses to the population could have been reduced by 50% or more. The delay meant that tens of thousands of people received radiation exposure that could have been prevented. The decision to lie, to minimize, to delay was not made out of cruelty. It was made out of fear. Fear of panic. Fear of political consequences. Fear of admitting that Soviet technology had failed catastrophically. But those fears led to decisions that harmed the very people the government claimed to be protecting. The firefighters who fought the blaze without being told about radiation exposure. The residents of Pripyat who lived normal lives for 36 hours while contamination accumulated.
The millions of people across Europe who were not warned that radioactive fallout was settling on their homes and farms. All of them paid the price for a lie that was supposed to protect Soviet prestige. By the time the truth emerged, forced out by Swedish scientists rather than volunteered by Soviet authorities, the damage had multiplied. The radiation that could have been measured and managed had spread uncontrolled. The people who could have been protected had been exposed. The trust that might have enabled cooperation had been destroyed. Chernobyl demonstrated that in the nuclear age, some disasters are too big to hide. Radiation does not respect borders or propaganda. It spreads according to physics, not politics. And when governments prioritize secrecy over safety, they do not contain disasters, they amplify them. The lie that began on the morning of April 26th would have consequences for decades. It would shape how the world responded to Chernobyl. It would affect how populations trusted their governments about nuclear safety. And it would establish a pattern of denial and minimization that would persist long after the graphite fire finally burned out. Because the hardest thing to contain after a nuclear accident is not the radiation. It is the truth. And the Soviet Union had just learned that truth, once released, cannot be controlled any more than radioactive particles in the wind. The evacuation of Pripyat was complete. The international community was demanding answers. The radiation cloud was spreading across the continent. And at the destroyed reactor, the graphite core continued to burn, releasing more contamination every hour. The disaster was no longer a secret.
Chapter 4. The Containment. The fire at Reactor 4's core burned for 9 days. During those 9 days, the Soviet Union mobilized resources on a scale unprecedented in peacetime disaster response. Helicopters dropped 5,000 tons of sand, lead, clay, and boron onto the exposed reactor. Miners dug tunnels beneath the ruins. Engineers designed solutions to problems no one had encountered before. And hundreds of thousands of people were exposed to radiation while trying to prevent the disaster from becoming exponentially worse. This was not a rescue operation. Nothing could be rescued. The reactor was destroyed beyond repair. The contamination had already spread. The people who received lethal doses in the first hours were already dying. What remained was damage control, preventing a second explosion, stopping the graphite fire, containing the radiation still being released. These were the only achievable goals. The effort would require sacrifices that tested the limits of what governments could ask citizens to endure. The helicopters. On the morning of April 27th, while Pripyat was being evacuated, military helicopters began arriving at Chernobyl. They came from bases across Ukraine and Belarus, conscripted for a mission their pilots did not fully understand. They were told to drop materials onto a fire at the nuclear plant. They were not told about the radiation that would saturate their aircraft with every pass over the reactor. General Nikolai Antishkin commanded the operation. He was 46 years old, an experienced military aviator who had flown combat missions in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan had not prepared him for this. There was no enemy to engage, no target to destroy. The mission was to drop bags of sand and boron onto a fire burning at temperatures that made precision impossible. The first helicopter made its approach at 8 a.m. The pilot, Vasily Rudakov, flew a Mi-8 transport helicopter loaded with bags of sand. His orders were to hover over the destroyed reactor and drop the bags directly into the core. The problem was that no one could tell him exactly where the core was. The reactor hall had been destroyed. Smoke obscured visibility. The radiation was so intense that instruments failed. Rudakov made his approach at 200 meters altitude.
His radiation detectors immediately maxed out. He could not see the core through the smoke. He dropped his load based on visual estimation and pulled away. Whether the sand reached the reactor was unclear. The smoke was too thick to confirm impact. More helicopters followed. Each pilot made multiple runs, dropping sand, then lead, then boron compounds meant to absorb neutrons and suppress any residual chain reactions. The missions were flown without proper radiation shielding. The aircraft's metal fuselages offered no protection. Every minute over the reactor, pilots absorbed radiation doses equivalent to multiple chest X-rays. By afternoon, pilots were showing symptoms: nausea, headaches, metallic taste. These were signs of acute radiation exposure. Medical staff examined the crews between missions and found radiation burns on hands and faces, skin reddening from gamma-ray damage. The doses were not immediately lethal, but they were accumulating. General Antishkin faced an impossible decision: continue the missions and expose his pilots to more radiation, or halt operations and let the reactor fire burn unchecked, potentially causing a second explosion. He chose to continue. The pilots did not refuse. They flew mission after mission, day after day, knowing each flight added to their radiation burden. Over 9 days, helicopter crews flew more than 1,800 missions. They dropped approximately 5,000 tons of material onto Reactor 4, sand to smother the fire, lead to block radiation, boron to absorb neutrons, clay and dolomite to seal cracks and prevent gases from escaping. The effort was unprecedented in aviation history. No one had attempted aerial firefighting over an active nuclear
reactor before. The operation had mixed results. Some material reached the core and helped contain the fire, but much of it landed on surrounding structures, adding weight to damaged buildings without directly affecting the reactor. Worse, the lead melted in the intense heat, potentially increasing temperatures in some areas rather than suppressing them. The boron compounds were more effective, reducing neutron activity and lowering the risk of renewed chain reactions. By May 6th, the graphite fire was finally extinguishing. Temperatures in the core began dropping. The massive release of radiation that had characterized the first days slowed to a steady seepage. The helicopter missions ended. The pilots returned to their bases. Many would develop cancers in subsequent years. Some died within a decade. But they had achieved their objective. The fire was contained. The miners. While helicopters attacked the problem from above, another operation was beginning below. Soviet authorities feared that molten nuclear fuel, heated to thousands of degrees, would burn through the reactor's concrete foundation and reach groundwater beneath the plant. If contaminated water entered the aquifer that supplied Kyiv, millions of people could be exposed. The solution was to dig a tunnel beneath Reactor 4 and install a cooling system to freeze the ground, preventing the molten fuel from melting through. This required tunneling through soil saturated with radiation, working in confined spaces with minimal protection, completing the project in weeks rather than months such work would normally require. On April 28th, coal miners from across Ukraine and Russia began arriving at Chernobyl. Most were young men in their 20s, experienced in underground work, but unfamiliar with radiation hazards. They were told the work was urgent. They were offered triple wages and medals for participation. They were not told that the radiation in the tunnels would be high enough to cause long-term health effects. The tunnel would be 150 meters long, dug from a point outside the reactor building to a position directly beneath the destroyed core. From there, miners would excavate a chamber where refrigeration equipment would be installed. The entire operation had to be completed before the molten fuel reached groundwater, a timeline measured in weeks. Work began on May 1st. The first team descended into a shaft dug at the edge of the reactor complex. They worked in shifts of 6 hours, alternating between digging and rest. The heat was intense. The tunnel had no ventilation system. Temperatures exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Men stripped to their underwear and still struggled with heat exhaustion. The radiation was worse than the heat. The soil they dug through was contaminated with particles that had settled after the explosion. Every shovelful of dirt contained isotopes that emitted gamma rays and alpha particles. The miners wore cloth masks that did nothing to filter radioactive dust. They breathed contaminated air. They touched contaminated walls with bare hands. Their radiation doses accumulated with every shift. Approximately 400 miners worked on the tunnel over the course of a month. They excavated by hand using picks and shovels in spaces too confined for machinery. They shored up walls with timber beams carried through tunnels barely wide enough for a man to crawl. They worked without proper safety equipment because proper equipment did not exist for this scenario. By the end of May, the tunnel was complete. The chamber beneath the reactor had been excavated. Refrigeration pipes were installed. The system was designed to freeze the ground solid, creating a barrier between the reactor and the water table below. Then they discovered the molten fuel had never reached the bottom of the reactor foundation. It had cooled and solidified on higher levels. The tunnel was unnecessary. The miners had exposed themselves to high radiation doses for a precaution that was turned out not to be needed. The Soviet government never acknowledged this publicly. The miners received their wages and medals. They went home and returned to their normal lives. Many developed health problems years later: cancers, blood disorders, immune deficiencies, conditions consistent with radiation exposure. But by then, proving causation was impossible. The official position was that radiation doses in the tunnel had been within safe limits. The miners' medical records suggested otherwise, but those records were not made public. The liquidators. The helicopter pilots and miners were part of a larger operation involving hundreds of thousands of workers, collectively known as liquidators. This term, chosen by Soviet authorities, referred to anyone involved in cleanup operations at Chernobyl between 1986 and 1990. The total number of liquidators remains uncertain. Official figures range from 600,000 to 800,000. Some estimates exceed 1 million. These were not volunteers. Most were military reservists called to active duty. Some were workers assigned by their enterprises. A few were genuine volunteers motivated by patriotism or duty. All were told the work was essential. Most were not told the full extent of radiation risks. The liquidators' tasks varied. Some operated heavy machinery to clear debris. Some washed contaminated surfaces with fire hoses. Some constructed the massive concrete sarcophagus that would eventually entomb the destroyed reactor. Some simply stood guard at checkpoints, preventing unauthorized entry to the exclusion zone. The most dangerous work involved clearing the reactor roof. The explosion had scattered highly radioactive graphite blocks and fuel fragments across the area. This material had to be removed before construction could begin on the sarcophagus. Robots were tried first. The radiation was so intense it destroyed their electronic systems within minutes. The work would have to be done by humans. These workers were called biorobots, a grim acknowledgement that humans were being used where machines had failed. Each man was allowed 90 seconds on the roof. They would run upstairs, grab whatever debris they could move, throw it into the reactor crater, and run back down. 90 seconds. Then the next man would go. The work was coordinated with military precision. Teams of 3 or 4 men would rotate through the roof in shifts.
Before ascending, they put on lead vests that provided minimal shielding. The vests weighed 25 kilograms and offered protection against gamma radiation, but nothing against alpha and beta particles. They were better than nothing, not by much. A typical shift involved approximately 30 seconds climbing stairs, 40 seconds working on the roof, and 20 seconds descending. During those 40 seconds of work, a man might be exposed to 100 Roentgen or more, roughly equivalent to 1,000 chest X-rays compressed into less than a minute. Thousands of men rotated through these 90-second shifts over the course of months. Each removed a few fragments of debris. Collectively, they cleared tons of radioactive material. The radiation doses they absorbed were carefully tracked by dosimeters. When a man reached his lifetime limit, he was rotated out and another took his place. The Soviet Union had enough manpower to treat humans as consumable resources. The liquidators worked under conditions that would be unthinkable in any other context. They operated in a landscape where everything was contaminated. The ground emitted radiation. The buildings emitted radiation. The vehicles they drove became radioactive from contact with contaminated surfaces. There was no safe place in the zone. There was only more dangerous and less dangerous. By 1990, when large-scale operations concluded, the Soviet government had spent billions of rubles on Chernobyl containment. They had mobilized nearly 1 million people. They had poured concrete and steel until the destroyed reactor was buried beneath a structure.
Designed to last 30 years, buying time for future generations to develop better solutions. The human cost remains disputed. Official Soviet statistics acknowledged 31 deaths in the immediate aftermath, mostly firefighters and plant operators who received massive radiation doses. They did not count liquidators who died months or years later from radiation-induced illnesses. Independent researchers estimate thousands of additional deaths from cancers and other radiation-related diseases. The true number may never be known. What is certain is that containment required sacrifices. Pilots flew through radiation clouds. Miners dug through contaminated soil. Workers absorbed doses that shortened their lives. They did this not because they were heroes, though some were. They did it because the Soviet system demanded it, and refusing was not an option for most. The disaster that began with an explosion in a reactor core had become a test of how many people a government could mobilize to contain a catastrophe of its own making. The Soviet Union passed that test. They contained the radiation. They prevented further explosions. They built a sarcophagus over the ruins. But the containment came at a price paid by hundreds of thousands of individuals who absorbed radiation so that millions of others would not have to. That was the bargain Chernobyl imposed. And the Soviet Union, facing the worst nuclear disaster in history, accepted those terms without hesitation.
Chapter 5. The Truth. 6 months after the explosion, Valery Legasov stood before the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna and lied to the world. Not completely, not about everything, but about the things that mattered most. About the design flaws that made the accident inevitable. About the institutional failures that had been accumulating for years. About the fact that Chernobyl was not an aberration, but a consequence of systemic problems the Soviet Union refused to acknowledge. Valery Legasov was one of the Soviet Union's leading nuclear scientists. He had been sent to Chernobyl hours after the explosion. He had coordinated scientific aspects of the response. He understood what had happened and why,
And in Vienna, in front of delegates from dozens of countries, he presented a version of events that protected Soviet nuclear technology while blaming human error. The operators had violated procedures, he explained. They had disabled safety systems. They had pushed the reactor into an unstable regime. The accident was their fault. Soviet reactor designs were sound. The RBMK was safe when operated correctly. Chernobyl proved the danger of human recklessness, not engineering failure. This was true. It was also incomplete. Legasov knew the RBMK had fundamental design flaws. He knew the positive void coefficient created inherent instability. He knew the control rod design flaw that caused the power spike. He knew Soviet nuclear safety culture prioritized production over protection. He knew all of this, and he said none of it in Vienna. Why? Because acknowledging design flaws would mean admitting that 16 other RBMK reactors operating across the Soviet Union were potentially dangerous. It would mean facing questions about why these flaws had never been addressed. It would mean international scrutiny of the Soviet nuclear program. And Valery Legasov, despite his scientific integrity, was still a Soviet citizen with obligations to his government. So he lied by omission. He presented facts that were true. He drew conclusions that were incomplete. He answered questions honestly, but did not volunteer information that was not specifically requested. And the international community, lacking access to Soviet internal documents, could not challenge what they did not know existed. But Legasov could not live with what he had done. Over the next 2 years, he would struggle with the moral weight of that presentation. He would write memoirs documenting the truth he had concealed. And on April 27, 1988, the second anniversary of the Chernobyl evacuation, he would take his own life. His suicide note would become one of the most important documents about Chernobyl. In it, Legasov detailed the design flaws, the institutional failures, the culture of denial that had made the disaster possible. He described how Soviet bureaucracy prioritized ideology over safety, how engineers who raised concerns were silenced, how problems identified years before the accident were never addressed because fixing them would require admitting mistakes. The note was suppressed by Soviet authorities, but copies circulated among scientists. Its contents would eventually be published, confirming what many had suspected. Chernobyl was not just operator error, it was system failure. The design flaws. The RBMK reactor had 2 critical design problems that Western reactors did not share. The first was the positive void coefficient, which had been known from the design phase but was considered manageable through operational procedures. Under normal conditions, water in the reactor served dual purposes as coolant and neutron absorber. When water turned to steam, it absorbed fewer neutrons. In Western reactors, this made the reaction decrease. In the RBMK, it made the reaction increase. This was not necessarily fatal. Many industrial systems have positive feedback mechanisms that are controlled through careful operation. The problem was that RBMK operators were never fully educated about the implications. Training materials mentioned the positive void coefficient, but did not emphasize the danger it posed at low power levels. Operators knew it existed. They did not understand what it meant. The second flaw was discovered only after the accident. The control rods, which were supposed to shut down the reactor instantly when inserted, had graphite tips 5 meters long. When the rods were fully withdrawn, these tips sat above the active core zone. When operators pressed the emergency shutdown button, the rods dropped under gravity.
But before the neutron-absorbing boron reached the core, the graphite tips entered from below. Graphite is a moderator. It increases reactivity. For approximately 3 seconds during emergency insertion, the graphite tips actually increased power in the lower part of the core before decreasing it overall. In a stable reactor, this brief spike was harmless. In a reactor already approaching criticality, it was catastrophic. This design flaw had been identified in 1983 during an incident at the Ignalina nuclear power plant in Lithuania. An RBMK reactor there had experienced a power surge during control rod insertion. Engineers investigated and discovered the graphite tip problem. They wrote reports. They recommended design modifications. Their recommendations were not implemented. The Soviet nuclear bureaucracy operated on the assumption that procedures could compensate for design weaknesses. If operators followed correct procedures, the graphite tip flaw would never cause problems. Therefore, expensive modifications were unnecessary. This assumption proved false on April 26, 1986. After Chernobyl, the Soviet Union retrofitted all remaining RBMK reactors to address both flaws. The modifications cost millions of rubles. They could have been implemented years earlier. They were not, because the system did not reward caution. It rewarded production quotas and schedule adherence. The culture of lies. Chernobyl was built on a foundation of institutional dishonesty that extended far beyond the design flaws. Construction quality was compromised to meet deadlines. Safety tests were falsified to show acceptable results. Maintenance was deferred because shutting down reactors reduced electricity production. Each of these decisions was rational within the Soviet system's incentive structure. Each made disaster more likely. During construction, quality control inspectors found numerous problems: welds that did not meet specifications, concrete that had not cured properly, components installed incorrectly. When they reported these issues, supervisors faced a choice: delay construction to fix problems, which would mean missing quotas and facing career consequences, or accept the flaws and hope the reactor's redundant safety systems would compensate. They chose the latter, repeatedly. The result was that Chernobyl operated for years with multiple construction defects that violated design specifications. None of these defects directly caused the accident, but they created a culture where cutting corners was normalized, where meeting deadlines mattered more than maintaining standards, where problems were concealed rather than addressed. Safety tests were similarly compromised. Soviet regulations required extensive testing before reactors entered service. These tests were supposed to verify that safety systems functioned correctly, but the tests were time-consuming. They sometimes revealed problems that required expensive fixes, so test results were often falsified. Engineers would conduct abbreviated tests, get acceptable results on some parameters, and report that all systems passed. This worked until it did not. Reactor 4's emergency cooling system had problems that should have been detected during commissioning tests. They were not, because the tests were not properly conducted. When the reactor exploded, some emergency systems failed to operate as designed because they had never been correctly tested.
Installed or tested. Maintenance followed the same pattern. Soviet nuclear plants operated on tight schedules with production quotas that had to be met regardless of equipment condition. Shutting down a reactor for maintenance meant lost electricity production. That meant supervisors explaining to Moscow why quotas were missed. The pressure was always to keep running, to defer maintenance, to fix only failures that made continued operation impossible. By 1986, Reactor 4 had accumulated numerous minor problems that maintenance could have addressed. None was critical. Together, they degraded the plant's margin of safety. When the test began on April 26th, multiple systems were not functioning optimally. This did not cause the accident, but it reduced the buffer between normal operation and catastrophe. The culture that allowed these compromises extended beyond Chernobyl. It characterized the entire Soviet nuclear program. Production quotas mattered more than safety margins. Political consequences deterred honest reporting. Engineers who raised concerns found their careers stalled. Those who concealed problems and met deadlines received promotions. Legasov documented this in his memoir. He described meetings where safety concerns were dismissed as alarmism. He recounted incidents where engineers were reprimanded for reporting problems rather than solving them quietly. He detailed how the system incentivized dishonesty at every level. This was not unique to the nuclear industry. Soviet aviation had similar problems. So did chemical plants, dams, and other infrastructure. But nuclear accidents have consequences that industrial accidents do not. Radiation does not dissipate. Contamination persists for decades. The cost of failure is measured in generations. Chernobyl proved that a culture of lies cannot sustain a technology that requires absolute honesty about risks and failures. You cannot operate nuclear reactors safely if reporting problems threatens careers. You cannot maintain complex systems if cutting corners is rewarded. You cannot prevent disasters if institutional pressure encourages concealment. The Soviet Union learned this lesson at enormous cost. 31 deaths officially acknowledged. Thousands more from radiation-induced cancers over subsequent decades. An entire city abandoned. 2,000 square kilometers of land rendered uninhabitable. Billions of rubles spent on containment and cleanup. And still, the full truth took years to emerge. The official report blamed operators. Internal documents blamed design flaws and institutional failures. Legasov's memoir, not published until after his death, blamed the culture that made catastrophic failure inevitable. The truth about Chernobyl was not just what happened in the reactor on April 26th. It was what happened in the years before, in the decisions made and not made, in the warnings ignored and problems concealed, in the system that prioritized ideology over reality. That truth destroyed Legasov. He could not reconcile his role in concealing it with his scientific integrity. He could not live with having lied to protect a system he knew was fundamentally broken. 2 years after Vienna, he recorded his memoirs and ended his life. His final words were not about reactor physics or engineering failures. They were about truth and the cost of concealing it. I did not understand at the time that the destruction of the reactor was inevitable. What destroyed it was the culture that made lying normal, that made compromises standard, that made expediency more important than accuracy. That culture did not die with Chernobyl, but Chernobyl forced it into the light. The disaster was too large to hide, the consequences too severe to ignore, the international pressure too intense to deflect. The truth emerged slowly, reluctantly, incompletely, but it emerged. And that truth changed how the Soviet Union and eventually the world understood nuclear power.
Technology that could be mastered through engineering alone, but as a system that required institutional honesty, transparent communication,
and the willingness to acknowledge that some risks cannot be managed through procedures if the culture surrounding them is fundamentally dishonest. Legasov understood this. He died trying to ensure others would too.
Chapter 6. The Aftermath. 28 years after the explosion, a new structure was taking shape beside the ruins of Reactor 4. It was called the New Safe Confinement, an arch of steel 110 meters tall, 260 meters wide, designed to last 100 years. When completed in 2016, it would be the largest movable structure ever built by humans. Its purpose? To contain the radioactive remains of the reactor that had already been entombed once before. The original sarcophagus, constructed in 1986, was never intended to be permanent. It was an emergency measure, built in months under impossible conditions. By 2016, it was failing. Cracks had appeared in the concrete. Radiation was leaking through gaps. The structure was unstable. A collapse would release radioactive dust across the region. The new safe confinement cost 2.2 billion euros, funded by 45 countries through the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It was assembled beside the reactor, then slid into place on rails, an engineering achievement that would have been impossible in 1986, but became necessary because the original solution was only ever meant to buy time. This is Chernobyl's aftermath in physical form, a problem that will never be solved, only managed, a danger that will persist for millennia, requiring continuous monitoring and intervention, a reminder that some disasters do not end, they simply change form. The contamination persists. The Chernobyl exclusion zone covers 2,600 square kilometers of land that will remain uninhabitable for centuries. The contamination is not uniform. Some areas received minimal fallout and could theoretically be resettled in decades. Others, particularly near the reactor, will remain lethally radioactive for thousands of years. Cesium-137, one of the primary contaminants, has a half-life of 30 years. This means half of it decays every 3 decades. After 30 years, half remains. After 60 years, a quarter. After 90 years, an eighth. It will take approximately 300 years for cesium contamination to decline to background levels. And cesium is one of the shorter-lived isotopes. Plutonium-239, also present in the soil, has a half-life of 24,000 years. The exclusion zone is not completely empty. Approximately 200 people, mostly elderly, returned to their homes despite official bans and radiation risks. They are called self-settlers or samosheli in Russian. They chose to live with contamination rather than die in relocation. Most are in their 80s and 90s now. When they pass, their homes will stand empty again. Wildlife has returned to the zone in abundance. Without human activity, the region has become an accidental nature preserve. Wolves, bears, elk, and lynx populate the forests. Bird populations have recovered. Some species rarely seen in Europe now thrive in areas too radioactive for permanent human habitation. This has led to debates about what the zone represents. Is it ecological recovery or radioactive wasteland? Both are true. The animals carry higher mutation rates. Some show elevated cancer incidence. But populations are growing. The absence of humans has allowed nature to reclaim the landscape, even if that nature is contaminated at a genetic level. Scientists study the zone as a unique laboratory.
Nowhere else on Earth can researchers examine multi-generational radiation exposure in wild populations. The data has implications for understanding how ecosystems adapt to contamination, how genetic damage propagates through breeding populations, how radiation affects evolution over decades. The forests continue to accumulate radioactive particles in soil and vegetation. When fires occur, they release radiation back into the atmosphere. In 2020, a major wildfire burned through contaminated forests, creating smoke that carried radioactive particles across Ukraine and Belarus. The disaster keeps giving, in unpredictable forms at unpredictable intervals. The human cost continues. Estimating Chernobyl's death toll requires
Defining what counts as a Chernobyl death. The Soviet Union acknowledged 31 immediate deaths, operators and firefighters who received massive acute doses. This number is not disputed, but it represents only direct, unambiguous casualties. The World Health Organization estimates that 4,000 additional deaths will eventually occur among the most highly exposed populations from radiation-induced cancers. This is a statistical projection, not a count of identified individuals. It represents the excess cancer deaths above baseline rates that can be attributed to Chernobyl exposure. Other organizations estimate higher numbers. Greenpeace projected 93,000 additional cancer deaths globally from Chernobyl fallout. This wider estimate includes lower-level exposures across Europe and accounts for cancers that might develop decades after exposure. The uncertainty range is enormous because detecting small increases in cancer rates amid much larger background rates is statistically difficult. What is certain is that thyroid cancer rates increased dramatically in children who were exposed to radioactive iodine in the weeks after the accident. Belarus, which received 70% of Chernobyl's fallout due to weather patterns, saw childhood thyroid cancer rates increase by a factor of 10 in contaminated regions. Most of these cancers were treatable, but they represented direct, measurable health consequences of radiation exposure. The liquidators, those who worked on cleanup, show elevated rates of leukemia and other radiation-sensitive cancers. Studies have documented increased mortality from various causes among liquidator populations. Proving that any individual's cancer was caused by Chernobyl exposure remains legally and scientifically complex, but population-level data shows clear increases. Mental health consequences are less quantifiable, but equally real. Depression, anxiety, and substance abuse rates increased in affected populations. The psychological impact of evacuation, loss of homes, ongoing health concerns, and social disruption cannot be separated from radiation effects, but contribute significantly to overall harm. The economic costs are clearer. The Soviet Union and its successor states spent hundreds of billions of dollars on Chernobyl response, cleanup, resettlement, and ongoing management. Belarus allocates 20% of its national budget to Chernobyl-related expenses decades after the accident. Ukraine faces similar burdens. These costs will continue for generations. The political consequences. Chernobyl accelerated the Soviet Union's collapse. This is debated among historians, but the evidence is substantial. The disaster exposed systematic failures in Soviet governance. The initial lies damaged trust in government statements. The inability to prevent or quickly contain the accident revealed technological limitations. The economic burden weakened an already struggling system. Mikhail Gorbachev later stated that Chernobyl was a turning point, perhaps the real cause of the Soviet Union's collapse 5 years later. The disaster demonstrated that the Soviet system could not manage the technologies it had developed. It showed that secrecy and centralized control were incompatible with complex industrial safety. It proved that ideology could not overcome physical reality. The accident forced glasnost, Gorbachev's policy of openness, to accelerate. The Soviet government could not maintain information control in the face of international pressure and obvious contamination.
They had to release more information, acknowledge more failures, permit more criticism than they had planned. Chernobyl created political space for transparency that widened into broader reforms. For the global nuclear industry, Chernobyl triggered re-evaluation of safety culture. The concept emerged that technical safety systems alone could not prevent accidents. Institutional culture, communication practices, and transparency mattered as much as engineering.
International cooperation on nuclear safety increased. The International Atomic Energy Agency gained authority to conduct safety reviews. Countries began sharing information about incidents that previously would have been concealed. But Chernobyl also effectively ended the nuclear power expansion that had characterized the 1970s and early 1980s. Public opposition to nuclear energy intensified. New plant construction slowed dramatically in many countries. The accident demonstrated that even low-probability events could have catastrophic consequences, a truth that risk calculations had always acknowledged, but that became emotionally and politically real after Chernobyl. The lesson no one wanted. The most important lesson of Chernobyl is the one most resistant to implementation. Complex systems fail in complex ways, and institutional culture determines whether those failures cascade into disasters. The RBMK design had flaws, but flaws alone do not cause disasters. Many technologies have design limitations that are managed through operational practices. What turned Chernobyl's design flaws into catastrophe was a culture that discouraged reporting problems, that pressured operators to meet schedules regardless of safety concerns, that punished caution and rewarded risk-taking. This culture was not unique to the Soviet Union. It exists wherever production pressures override safety considerations, wherever reporting problems threatens careers, wherever institutional incentives reward concealment over transparency. Chernobyl demonstrated what happens when that culture intersects with nuclear technology. The consequences are measurable in centuries. Yet the lesson remains difficult to apply. Institutional culture is harder to fix than engineering problems. You can redesign a reactor. You cannot easily redesign how organizations make decisions, how information flows, how risks are communicated and prioritized. Culture change requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how systems actually operate versus how they are supposed to operate. Chernobyl forced that confrontation for nuclear power. The industry that emerged from the disaster was more transparent, more internationally cooperative, more focused on safety culture. But it took a catastrophe to achieve what should have been standard practice from the beginning. The disaster proved that some technologies demand institutional honesty because the cost of failure is too high to tolerate anything less. Nuclear power is one, but the principle applies more broadly. Any complex system operating with narrow safety margins requires cultural practices that encourage reporting problems early, that reward caution, that make safety more important than schedule or production. Chernobyl demonstrated the price of violating those principles. A reactor destroyed, a city abandoned, thousands dead, hundreds of billions in economic costs, contamination that will persist for millennia, all because a culture of lies could not sustain a technology that required truth. The sarcophagus that now covers Reactor 4 is a monument to that failure. It will stand for a century, requiring maintenance and monitoring, a permanent reminder that some mistakes cannot be fixed. They can only be contained at enormous cost for as long as the containment holds. And beneath that steel arch, the reactor core remains. The uranium has stopped fissioning, the graphite has stopped burning, but the radiation persists, slowly declining over timescales that dwarf human lifespans. In 300 years, the cesium will have decayed.
In 24,000 years, the plutonium will be half gone. In 100,000 years, the site might approach background radiation levels. Until then, Chernobyl waits, not threatening, not growing, just persisting. A wound in the landscape that will outlive everyone who remembers the disaster firsthand, everyone who responds to it now, everyone who will be born in the next several centuries. The exclusion zone will remain.
Monitoring will continue. The new safe confinement will eventually be replaced by another structure when it fails, and the core, buried beneath concrete and steel, will continue its slow decay, indifferent to human timescales, following only the physics of radioactive half-lives. This is Chernobyl's aftermath. Not an ending, but a transition from acute disaster to permanent condition, from emergency response to perpetual management, from crisis to legacy. The disaster that began at 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, will never truly end. It will only transform, generation after generation, into new forms of consequence that we will manage because we have no choice, because the alternative to containment is acceptance of risks we cannot tolerate. So we build structures that will outlast us. We monitor contamination that will outlive our grandchildren. We maintain barriers around a danger that will persist for longer than civilizations typically last. This is the bargain Chernobyl imposed. This is the price of the mistake. And we pay it year after year. Because 38 years ago, a reactor exploded and proved that some disasters cannot be undone. They can only be endured.